Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. In a quiet American town, a wealthy man was found dead in his own home. At first, it looked like tragedy, but soon investigators uncovered a story of secrets, betrayal, and poison. At the center of it all was his wife, Claire Evans, a woman whose calm smile unsettled everyone who saw it. As the evidence piled up, the trial that followed shocked the nation. Because while most people weep or break in court, Claire did something else. She smiled. It was a quiet evening in the town of Willow Creek. The houses stood neatly along the streets, the lights glowing softly in the windows. Families were finishing their dinners, children were getting ready for bed, and nothing seemed unusual. But inside one large house at the end of Maple Street, something terrible had already happened. The Evans house looked perfect from the outside. It had a white fence, trimmed bushes, and a shiny car in the driveway. Inside, however, the life of Richard Evans had just ended. He was a wealthy businessman, known in town for his real estate company and his expensive taste. He lived there with his wife, Claire Evans, who was admired for her beauty and charm. She was always polite, always smiling, and always dressed well. But that evening, Richard lay motionless in his study, a wine glass tipped over on the desk. Beside him, it was the housekeeper, Maria, who discovered him. She had come in to tidy up and found her employer slumped in his chair. At first, she thought he had fallen asleep, but when she touched his shoulder, she screamed. His skin was cold. The wine glass smelled strange, sharp, and bitter, not like wine at all. Maria ran to the phone and called the police, her hands shaking. Within minutes, the sound of sirens broke the stillness of Maple Street. Neighbors peeked out from their windows as flashing lights filled the night. Officers moved quickly, setting up tape around the Evans home. Detective Paul Morgan was called to the scene. He was a middle-aged man with a calm voice and sharp eyes. He had solved many difficult cases, but something about this one felt different. When he entered the study, he saw the lifeless body of Richard Evans, the spilled wine, and the quiet figure of Claire standing in the corner. She did not cry. She did not shout. She only stood there, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her lips curved in the faintest smile. "I don't understand," Maria sobbed from the hallway. "He was fine this morning. He was laughing, drinking his coffee. How can he be gone?" Detective Morgan knelt beside the desk, examining the glass. He noticed the smell at once. Poison, he thought. He had seen it before. He ordered the officers to secure the glass and take samples from the bottle. He then turned to Claire. "Mrs. Evans, I'm very sorry for your loss," he said carefully. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Claire tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "We were having dinner together. Richard poured himself some wine. I went upstairs to change. When I came back, he was like this." Her voice was steady, almost too steady. Most spouses in such a situation were overwhelmed with grief or panic. But Claire's composure unsettled. Paul. Her smile never faded, even as officers moved around the room collecting evidence. Word of Richard Evans's death spread quickly through Willow Creek. Neighbors whispered to one another, shocked that such a thing could happen in their quiet town. Some expressed sympathy for Claire, while others whispered that something about her reaction felt strange. The autopsy confirmed Paul's suspicion. Richard had been poisoned with a powerful substance mixed into his wine. It was not an accident. Someone had placed it there deliberately. The investigation began at once. Officers spoke with family members, friends, and employees. Many of them said that Richard and Claire's marriage had not been as perfect as it looked. Behind the polished smiles and fancy dinners, there had been arguments. Richard had spoken to close friends about filing for divorce. He worried about money, property, and what would happen if he left Claire. One of Richard's business partners told the detectives, "He said she would take everything. He said he felt trapped." Meanwhile, Claire continued to act calm whenever questioned. She attended Richard's funeral in a black dress, her hair neatly styled, her lips still curved in that same soft smile. People in the crowd noticed and whispered. Most widows cried openly, but Claire did not shed a single tear. Detective Morgan watched her carefully. He had seen many faces of grief in his career, but hers did not look like grief at all. It looked like satisfaction, hidden beneath politeness. A week after the funeral, investigators uncovered more clues. They found receipts for chemicals purchased under a false name, and the handwriting on the form looked very much like Claire's. They also found records of large bank transfers Richard had made into an account that Claire controlled. And then came the biggest discovery of all: secret letters exchanged between Claire and a younger man, a fitness trainer named Kyle, whom she had been seeing in secret. The letters spoke of freedom, of money, of a new life. They also hinted at Richard being an obstacle. Detective Morgan read the letters with a heavy heart. The picture was becoming clearer. A wealthy husband planning divorce, a wife who would lose her comfort and fortune, a secret lover waiting in the background, and then a glass of poisoned wine. When Paul returned to question Claire again, she welcomed him into her living room with a graceful smile. The house was spotless, and she served tea as though he were a guest, not a detective. "Mrs. Evans," Paul began, "we have some new information. Did you know your husband was considering divorce?" Claire stirred her tea gently, her expression unchanged. "Richard said many things. He was a complicated man." "And these receipts," Paul continued, sliding papers across the table. "Chemicals purchased just weeks before his death. Do you recognize the handwriting?" Claire glanced at the papers, then set her cup down. "People make mistakes with handwriting all the time," she said softly. Paul studied her carefully. Still, no fear, no anger, no sadness. Only that unsettling smile. The evidence was pointing strongly at Claire, but what disturbed Paul most was not just the facts. It was her behavior. Most people, when accused, protested with tears, anger, or fear. But Claire only smiled, as if the entire situation amused her. By now, the media had caught the story. Headlines filled the papers. "Wealthy husband dead in poison plot. Did smiling widow kill for fortune?" Reporters gathered outside the Evans home, shouting questions whenever Claire appeared. She never hid. She always looked straight into the cameras, her smile shining as though she enjoyed the attention. For Paul, the case had just begun, but already he knew it would not be an ordinary investigation. He had faced liars, thieves, and killers before. But never someone like Claire Evans, a woman who could stand over her husband's body and smile as though nothing had happened. And so the story of the smiling widow began, with a poisoned glass of wine, a dead businessman, and a woman who showed no trace of remorse. Detective Paul Morgan returned to the station late at night with the case files stacked high on his desk. He sat with a cup of coffee, staring at the photographs of Richard Evans, the wine glass, and the receipts. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but he knew the most difficult part would be proving Claire Evans was behind it all. The next morning, Paul and his partner, Officer Daniel Harris, visited the Evans home again. Claire welcomed them in as if they were friends, offering coffee and sitting gracefully in her chair. Her calmness unsettled Daniel, who whispered to Paul, "She doesn't even act nervous." Paul asked her about the night of Richard's death again, hoping to catch a change in her story, but Claire spoke with the same steady voice. "Richard poured the wine himself. I wasn't even in the room when he drank it. Maybe someone else got to the bottle before him." She sipped her coffee and gave a small smile as if enjoying the game. After the interview, Daniel muttered, "She's lying, but she makes it sound so normal." Paul nodded. He had seen suspects crack under pressure, but Claire never did. Her face, her voice, and even her posture remained calm, as if she had nothing to fear. The investigation moved forward. Detectives pulled Richard's financial records. They found that weeks before his death, he had been meeting with a lawyer to discuss divorce papers. He had told the lawyer that he was worried about Claire taking everything he owned. He wanted to protect his business, his money, and his property. When the lawyer testified to this, it painted a clear picture of motive. Claire would lose her wealth and lifestyle if Richard left her. The inheritance from his death gave her everything she wanted. Paul and his team also spoke with Richard's friends. One, a man named David Clark, explained that Richard often complained about Claire's behavior. "She was cold," David said. "She cared about money, not him, and Richard knew it." Another friend recalled Richard saying he felt unsafe at home. He said he was sleeping less, drinking more, and worried she was watching his every move. Meanwhile, investigators looked deeper into Claire's secret life. They found evidence of her relationship with Kyle, the younger trainer. Kyle at first denied knowing her, but under pressure, he admitted they had been meeting in secret. "She said she felt trapped in her marriage," he told detectives. "She said Richard was cruel, but I never thought she would kill him." Paul asked Kyle if Claire ever spoke about Richard's money. Kyle lowered his head and said, "She mentioned that when he was gone, she would finally be free, but I thought it was just talk." That testimony gave the case even more strength. Now they had proof of motive, opportunity, and secret planning. Still, Claire did not break. When confronted with Kyle's words, she only smiled faintly and said, "People say many things when they are scared." Her behavior spread through town like wildfire. Neighbors who once admired her now crossed the street to avoid her. Mothers whispered about her at the grocery store. "How can she smile after all this?" one woman asked. Another replied, "It's not natural. It's scary." Paul felt the same unease. Late at night, he reviewed the evidence again, but what kept him awake was the memory of Claire's calm face. She did not act like someone who had lost a husband, nor like someone fighting to prove innocence. She acted like someone enjoying the attention. The district attorney, Margaret Lewis, studied the case and made her decision. "We have enough," she said firmly. "We'll charge Claire Evans with first-degree murder. We'll show the jury that she killed her husband for money and a new life." When the arrest warrant was served, officers arrived at the Evans home. Claire opened the door, dressed neatly as always, her hair perfect. She did not resist. She did not cry. She simply said, "I knew this day would come," and smiled for the cameras as reporters snapped photographs. The headline the next morning was bold and shocking. "The Smiling Widow Arrested for Murder." Claire's arrest became national news. Television anchors debated her case, psychologists were invited to speak about her lack of emotion, and newspapers called her the woman with the smile of stone. Some believed she was guilty. Others wondered if she was a victim of gossip and appearance. But everyone agreed she was unforgettable. In jail, Claire remained calm. Guards said she walked the halls with a straight back and a faint smile, never arguing, never breaking rules. Other inmates watched her with suspicion, but Claire seemed untouched by their stares. Detective Paul visited her one last time before the trial. Sitting across the glass divider, he studied her face. "Why do you keep smiling?" he asked quietly. Claire leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Because they want me to cry. They want me to fall apart. But I won't give them that." Paul frowned. "Do you feel any guilt? Any regret for what happened to Richard?" Her smile widened. "Regret is for weak people. I am not weak." Paul left the room unsettled. He had heard many things from criminals over the years, but Claire's words echoed in his mind. She was not only without remorse, she was proud of it. The trial date was set. Reporters filled the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as Claire was led inside. She wore a bright dress, her head held high, smiling as if she were walking into a party rather than a murder trial. Paul watched from a distance. He knew the hardest part of this case was not only proving her guilt, but also making the world see past her unsettling charm. And so the stage was set. A courtroom packed with people, a jury ready to listen, a prosecutor determined to win, and a woman accused of murder who refused to stop smiling. The case was no longer just about Richard's death. It was about the strange face of a killer who showed no fear, no sorrow, and no remorse. The courthouse in Willow Creek was an old brick building with tall wooden doors and narrow windows. On the morning of the trial, it was surrounded by reporters, photographers, and curious townsfolk. Some held notebooks, others held cameras, and everyone wanted to see the woman who had shocked the town. When Claire Evans stepped out of the police car, the crowd erupted. Flashbulbs went off, reporters shouted her name, and people leaned forward to catch a glimpse. Claire wore a light blue dress, her hair neatly brushed, and she walked as if she were attending a social event. Her lips curved into that same calm smile, the one that unsettled everyone who looked at her. Inside the courtroom, the seats were filled. Families of Richard Evans's friends sat near the front, whispering quietly. Across the aisle, Claire's relatives sat stiffly, unsure of what to say or believe. At the front of the room, the jury filed in, their faces serious as they prepared to hear the case. The prosecutor, Margaret Lewis, stood tall at her table. She had worked on many difficult trials, but she knew this one was different. The whole town, maybe even the whole country, was watching. On the other side of the courtroom, Claire's defense attorney, Thomas Briggs, adjusted his papers. He was calm, experienced, and determined to protect his client no matter the odds. When Claire entered and sat down, her smile never faded. She looked at the jury, the judge, the prosecutor, and even the crowd as if she were greeting guests at her home. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge called the court to order, and the trial began. Margaret spoke first. She told the jury about Richard Evans, a successful man whose life was cut short. She described the poisoned wine, the troubled marriage, the divorce papers, and the secret relationship with Kyle, the trainer. She said Claire killed Richard for money and freedom, and she had done it with cold planning. Margaret raised her voice as she pointed to Claire. The woman sitting before you chose greed over life. She watched her husband die, and she smiled through it all. The courtroom was silent, the words sinking into every ear. Then it was Thomas Briggs's turn. He stood calmly and spoke in a soft but firm tone. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is not a murderer. She is a wife who has lost her husband, a woman being painted as a monster because she refuses to break down in tears. Smiling does not make someone guilty. It makes them strong. He argued that Richard had many enemies in business, that anyone could have slipped poison into the wine. He said the prosecution's case was built on guesses and appearances, not proof. The trial moved forward with witness after witness. Richard's lawyer testified about the divorce plans. Richard's friends spoke about his fears of Claire. A chemist explained how the poison worked and how it matched the substance found in Richard's glass. Through it all, Claire sat quietly, listening with a soft smile. Sometimes she tilted her head, sometimes she tapped her fingers on the table. But she never looked nervous. The jury noticed, and so did the reporters. The next day's newspaper headline read, "The Widow Who Smiles Through Murder Trial." Detective Paul Morgan took the stand and described the investigation. He spoke about the receipts for the poison, the hidden letters between Claire and Kyle, and the wooden box found in her home with financial documents. He explained how everything pointed back to Claire. When the defense cross-examined him, Thomas Briggs asked, "Detective, did you see Mrs. Evans put poison in the glass?" Paul answered honestly, "No. But the evidence shows she is the only one who could have done it." The defense attorney smiled and turned to the jury. "So you admit, Detective, that you never saw her commit this crime? You only believe it?" Paul kept his voice steady. "I don't just believe it, I know it. The evidence speaks for itself." Claire's smile widened at that moment, as if amused that even the detective seemed unsettled by her. The prosecution then called Kyle, the trainer, to testify. Kyle looked nervous as he sat in the witness chair. He admitted to his relationship with Claire, and he admitted that she spoke often about money and freedom. When asked if she ever talked about Richard's death, Kyle hesitated before saying, "She once told me that nothing stood between us but time." Margaret pressed him. "And what did you think she meant?" Kyle swallowed hard. "I thought she meant divorce, but now, I don't know." The jury watched closely, taking notes. Kyle's words gave the prosecution more power, but Claire never looked concerned. She only smiled at him from her seat, a smile that made him shift uncomfortably in the witness chair. The defense then presented their own witnesses. A neighbor testified that Claire had always been kind and helpful. A family friend said Richard was a difficult man, and perhaps he made enemies in business. Thomas Briggs argued that the case had too many holes. "The prosecution wants you to see a villain because she does not act the way you expect," he told the jury. "But justice is not about smiles or frowns. It is about proof." The days stretched into weeks. Each morning, Claire entered the courtroom as if it were a stage, dressed elegantly, smiling for the cameras. Each evening, the newspapers printed more stories about her, and the nation became fascinated. Some called her cold and evil. Others said she was being judged for her behavior rather than evidence. Detective Paul watched it all from the gallery. He had spent months on the case, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, piecing together the truth. But even he sometimes found himself unsettled by Claire's calmness. It was as if she were in control, not the court, not the judge, not the jury. As the trial reached the halfway point, the jury had heard about the motive, the poison, the affair, and the inheritance. They had also seen Claire's unshakable smile. For many, that smile spoke louder than any word. The question hanging over the courtroom was clear. Would the jury see through the smile and believe the evidence, or would Claire's composure convince them that she was the victim of a cruel misunderstanding? The answer would come soon, but for now, the trial of the smiling widow kept everyone on edge, and the whole town waited to see what the jury would decide. The courthouse was filled with tension as the trial entered its second week. Every day more people came, hoping to find a seat inside. Those who couldn't fit stood outside, waiting for updates. Reporters filled the hallways, rushing to send stories to their papers. The case of Claire Evans had become more than a trial. It was a show that everyone wanted to see. On the morning of the fourth day, Claire walked into the courtroom in a bright yellow dress. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and she lifted her chin proudly, smiling at all of them. To many, watching, it seemed like she enjoyed the attention. To others, it looked like arrogance. Inside, the jury sat stiffly, their eyes following her every move. Judge Raymond Carter, an older man with a firm voice, called for silence and began the day's proceedings. The prosecution brought forward more evidence. Margaret Lewis, the district attorney, held up the wine glass found in Richard's study. She explained to the jury how traces of poison were found inside. A chemist testified, describing how the substance had been bought only weeks before. Then Margaret displayed the receipts. She placed them on the table and asked the jury to look closely at the handwriting. Side by side, the receipts and Claire's own writing looked almost identical. "This," Margaret said firmly, "is not a coincidence. This is planning." Claire sat still, her lips curved into that faint smile, her eyes calm. She looked at the jury as if she were unconcerned. The defense fought back. Thomas Briggs argued that handwriting analysis was not perfect, that mistakes could happen. He suggested that someone else could have forged her writing to frame her. "We cannot convict a woman because her handwriting looks similar," he told the jury. "That is not proof." The next witness was Maria, the housekeeper. She spoke softly, her voice trembling as she recalled the night she found Richard in the study. "I went in to clean, and he was sitting so still. I thought he was asleep. But when I touched him, he was cold. The glass smelled strange. I called, 'The police right away?'" Margaret asked. "And where was Mrs. Evans at that moment?" Maria hesitated. "She came down the stairs after I screamed. She was calm, too calm. She just stood there looking at him." The jury leaned forward. Margaret pressed. "Did she show sadness? Did she cry?" Maria shook her head. "No, she just smiled." There was a murmur in the courtroom. People glanced at Claire, who sat with the same calm expression. Thomas Briggs rose to question Maria. "Mrs. Evans had just lost her husband. People react in different ways. Isn't it possible that what you saw as calmness was shock?" Maria bit her lip. "I don't know. But it didn't feel like shock." Margaret then called Richard's lawyer to the stand. He confirmed that Richard had been planning divorce and wanted to protect his fortune. "He told me he was afraid she would take everything. He wanted to end it cleanly, but he worried about her reaction." The courtroom grew tense. The motive was clear. If Richard had divorced Claire, she would lose her wealth and lifestyle. With his death, she inherited it all. Through all of this, Claire never showed anger or fear. When the testimony grew intense, she sometimes smiled wider, as if amused. Some jurors avoided looking directly at her, unsettled by her expression. During a break, reporters rushed outside to deliver their updates. "The smiling widow," one headline read that evening, "listens to evidence without a tear." When court resumed, the defense tried to shift focus. They argued that Richard had many business rivals. Some men lost money because of his deals. "Any one of them could have poisoned him," Thomas Briggs said. "Why must it be Claire Evans?" He called a business partner to the stand, who admitted that Richard's work had made him enemies. But Margaret countered with strong evidence. Only Claire had access to Richard's study that night, and only she had reason to gain from his death. Finally, Margaret called Detective Paul Morgan back to the stand. He walked the jury step by step through the investigation. He explained how they followed the receipts, the letters with Kyle, the financial records, and the evidence found in the house. "All paths," he said firmly, "lead back to Claire Evans." Briggs questioned him again. "Detective, you never saw her commit the act, correct?" Paul nodded. "That's true, but all the evidence points to her. No one else had the opportunity. No one else had the motive. And no one else smiled while standing over her husband's body." A silence filled the courtroom. Claire tilted her head, her smile widening at Paul's words. For a moment, the room seemed colder. The day ended with the jury looking tired, their notes filled with details. The crowd outside buzzed with talk. Some believed the case was sealed. Others said Claire's calmness meant she was being wrongly accused. But no one could ignore her. That evening, news channels replayed footage of her entering the court in her bright yellow dress, smiling for the cameras. Commentators debated her behavior. "It is chilling," one said. "She looks like she's enjoying this." Another replied, "Or maybe it's her way of surviving the pressure. We don't know." But Detective Paul knew. Sitting in his small office late at night, he thought about her smile. It was not a mask of survival. It was not the shock of grief. It was pride. She enjoyed the attention. She enjoyed being remembered. The trial was far from over. More witnesses would come, More arguments would be made, and the jury would have to decide. But for Paul, the truth was already clear. Claire Evans had killed her husband, and she would never admit it. She would only smile. The next day promised more testimony, more tension, and more of that unsettling grin that had already earned her a name across the country. The woman who showed no remorse. The trial pressed forward, and by now the courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It felt like a stage, and everyone knew the main performer was Claire Evans. Each day she arrived in bright clothes, her hair styled neatly, and that same unsettling smile resting on her lips. Reporters snapped pictures, jurors tried not to stare, and people whispered that she looked more like a guest at a celebration than a woman fighting for her life. On the fifth morning, the prosecution brought in new witnesses. One of Richard's old friends, Ellen Roberts, walked slowly to the stand. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Ellen had known both Richard and Claire for years, and her testimony promised to give the jury a deeper look into their private life. "Mrs. Roberts," Margaret Lewis began, "can you tell the court about your conversations with Claire Evans before Richard's death?" Ellen nodded, her voice soft. She sometimes joked about how life insurance was the easiest money a woman could have. She said it with a smile, like it was a joke, but it always made me uncomfortable. The jury scribbled in their notebooks. Margaret pressed further. "Did she ever speak about Richard directly?" "Yes," Ellen whispered. "She once said she could get away with anything if she wanted to, that nothing could touch her." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Margaret turned toward the jury. "You heard that with your own ears?" "I did," Ellen said firmly. Claire sat still, her face calm. When the courtroom noise grew louder, she even laughed softly, a sound that sent chills through the room. The defense jumped up quickly. Thomas Briggs tried to discredit Ellen, saying that memories could be faulty and that a simple joke should not be twisted into evidence of murder. "We've all said careless things in our lives," he told the jury. "It doesn't make us killers." But Ellen's words left a heavy mark. The next witness was a co-worker of Richard, a man named John Miller. He told the jury that Richard often complained about his marriage. "He said Claire didn't care about him," John said. "He told me once that he thought she wanted him gone." Again, Claire only smiled. Later that afternoon, Detective Paul Morgan was called again. Margaret asked him to describe Claire's behavior on the night Richard was found. Paul cleared his throat and looked at the jury. "She stood in the corner of the study, calm as could be. Most wives scream or cry. Claire didn't. She folded her hands and smiled." Some jurors glanced at Claire then, trying to see what Paul meant. Claire noticed and smiled directly at them, as if proving his words true. One juror shifted uncomfortably, another looked away. When the defense cross-examined Paul, Briggs asked, "Detective, can you read minds? Can you know what Mrs. Evans felt that night?" "No," Paul replied. "But I know what I saw, and what I saw was no grief." The trial continued with more evidence, but what captured the most attention was not the documents or the testimony. It was Claire's reaction to them. When witnesses cried describing Richard, she smiled. When the prosecutor displayed the poisoned glass, she tilted her head as though it amused her. When the judge scolded the courtroom for noise, Claire let out a small laugh that echoed across the silent room. The press gave her a name that stuck, the Smiling Widow. Newspapers printed it in bold letters. Television anchors repeated it with dramatic voices. People across the country debated her behavior. Some said she was evil. Others argued she was simply misunderstood. But everyone agreed she was unforgettable. During one session, Margaret presented the letters between Claire and Kyle, the trainer. She read them aloud, showing how Claire wrote about a new life and freedom once Richard was gone. Kyle sat in the courtroom, his face pale as he listened. When Margaret asked him again if Claire had ever mentioned Richard's death, Kyle admitted, "She said time was the only thing in our way. Now I think she meant something more." Claire turned her head toward him and gave him a smile so cold that he lowered his eyes at once. The defense tried to counter by saying the letters were taken out of context, that every unhappy spouse dreamed of freedom. "Words are not crimes," Briggs told the jury. "We must focus on facts, not feelings." But the facts and the feelings were now bound together, and Claire's smile only deepened the sense of unease. As the week closed, Margaret made one more powerful move. She played a recording of a phone call Richard had made to a close friend just days before his death. In the call, Richard's voice was tired and nervous. He said, "If anything happens to me, it's Claire. I don't trust her anymore." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone looked at Claire, waiting for her reaction. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and smiled wider than ever before. That moment was captured by photographers, and the image appeared on front pages across the nation the next day. Claire Evans smiling as her husband's fearful words were played in court. In the judge's chambers later that evening, Margaret spoke quietly to Paul. "She's not just on trial for murder anymore. She's on trial for her soul." Paul nodded. "And the jury is watching every smile." The case was building toward its climax. More evidence had been shown, more witnesses had spoken, and the weight of guilt pressed heavier on Claire. Yet through it all, she never bent, never wept, never frowned. As the judge dismissed the court for the day, Claire stood, smoothed her dress, and looked once more at the jury. With the same calm tone she had used since the beginning, she whispered, "I told you they'd never forget me." Her words were not meant for the record. They were meant for memory, and the jury would carry them long after they left the courtroom. The final days of the trial arrived. The courthouse felt heavier than ever, the air filled with whispers and tension. Crowds gathered outside from the early morning, hoping to see the moment everyone knew was coming. Reporters set up cameras and microphones, ready to capture history. Inside, the jury looked worn from weeks of testimony. They had seen the poison receipts, the letters, the financial records, and heard the phone call Richard made before his death. They had watched Claire Evans every single day, her smile never fading. Now it was almost time for them to decide. The prosecution gave its closing arguments first. Margaret Lewis stood tall, her voice steady. She spoke of Richard Evans, a man whose life was stolen by the person who should have loved him most. She told the jury that Claire had motive, opportunity, and planning. She pointed at Claire and said, "This woman did not lose control. She calculated. She poisoned her husband for money, for freedom, and for another man. And when she was caught, she smiled." Margaret held up the photo taken in court when Richard's phone call was played. "This," she said, her voice sharp, "is not grief. This is not innocence. This is coldness. This is pride." The room was silent except for the sound of her words echoing. Then it was Thomas Briggs's turn. He walked slowly before the jury, his voice calm and even. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard many things, but what you have not heard is direct proof. No one saw Claire Evans put poison in that glass. No one can say for certain what happened in that room. The prosecution wants you to believe smiles equal guilt, but is that justice, or is that fear of what we do not understand?" He reminded them that Richard had business rivals, that enemies existed, and that the law required proof beyond doubt. "If you have even a shadow of doubt, you cannot convict," he said firmly. Claire sat still through it all, her hands folded neatly, her lips curved upward. When the judge gave his instructions, the jury listened carefully. Then they were led out to deliberate. The courtroom emptied into hushed hallways. Reporters rushed to telephones and cameras. Families waited in silence. Hours passed. Then night fell, and the jury was still locked away. Detective Paul Morgan sat in a chair outside the courtroom, staring at the floor. He had worked hard to bring this case together, but now it was out of his hands. Margaret joined him, her face tired but determined. "They'll see it," she said quietly. "They'll see what she is?" Paul nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He knew juries could be unpredictable. The next morning, word spread that the jury had reached a decision. Crowds filled the courthouse again. The Evans family members arrived, their faces pale but hopeful. Claire walked in wearing a pale pink dress, her smile softer but still present. The jury filed in, their expressions serious. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreman, an older man with glasses, stood and held a folded piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." The paper was handed to the judge, who read it silently before passing it back. The foreman cleared his throat and spoke the words that would be remembered for years. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Claire Evans, guilty." The courtroom gasped. Some cried, some sighed with relief. Margaret closed her eyes and let out a deep breath. Paul clenched his fists, knowing justice had been done. But Claire? Claire smiled. Wider than ever, Judge Carter called for order as the room buzzed with noise. He then looked at Claire and said firmly, "Claire Evans, you have been found guilty of murder. For your crime, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Again the crowd gasped. Families hugged one another. Reporters rushed to write their stories. Cameras flashed wildly, and Claire leaned toward her lawyer, whispered something, and then turned to the jury. Her smile stretched across her face as she spoke loud enough for all to hear. "I told you. They'd never forget me." The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down, others stared back at her in disbelief. The moment was captured in photographs. The woman smiling as she was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like fire. Headlines read, "Smiling widow convicted, Claire Evans shows no," "Remorse," and "A chilling smile at justice." Television anchors replayed footage of her smiling as the verdict was read, calling it one of the most disturbing moments in recent trial history. In interviews later, some jurors admitted that her smile had haunted them. "We had the evidence," one said, "but even if we didn't, that smile told us everything." Detective Paul Morgan left the courthouse that day with mixed emotions. Justice had been served, but he knew Claire's story would not fade quickly. People would talk about her for years, not only because of her crime, but because of the way she carried herself through it all. Margaret Lewis told reporters, "This was not just a trial about murder. This was a trial about coldness, about the absence of remorse. And that is why justice demanded this verdict." Meanwhile, Claire was led away in handcuffs, her smile never leaving her face. Reporters shouted questions, but she did not answer. She only turned her head slightly, letting the cameras capture her grin one last time before the prison gates closed behind her. The verdict ended the trial, but it began something else. A legend of darkness that people would whisper about for years. Claire Evans, the woman who poisoned her husband, had become more than a criminal. She had become a symbol of coldness, a face that haunted everyone who saw it. And though she was now locked away, her smile remained etched in the memory of the town, the jury, and the nation that watched. Claire Evans was taken to Blackstone State Prison, a gray building with high fences and watchtowers. The gates shut behind her, but even there she kept her composure. Guards expected anger or tears, but she only walked calmly, her lips curved. In that same quiet smile, her first days inside were watched closely. Other inmates whispered about her as she passed through the halls. Some called her the Smiling Widow, the name given by the newspapers. Others avoided her, unsettled by her calm expression. She never argued with guards, never raised her voice. She ate her meals quietly, read books in the library, and carried herself like someone untouched by the world around her. But it was her smile that drew the most attention. Even in the bleak prison yard with gray skies and cold winds, she sat on a bench with a faint smile, as if she still held a secret no one else knew. Guards sometimes shook their heads, saying it gave them chills. Outside the prison walls, her story continued to spread. Documentaries were made about her case. Headlines called her the woman who smiled through justice. Television anchors replayed the moment she grinned at the jury after being sentenced to life. Criminologists wrote articles saying she showed classic signs of a person without remorse, someone who enjoyed the power of attention more than anything else. Detective Paul Morgan moved on to other cases, but the memory of Claire never left him. Late at night, he sometimes replayed the trial in his mind, remembering how her smile never faded. He told his colleagues that evidence was important, but so was behavior. She showed us who she was without saying a word, he said. Margaret Lewis, the prosecutor, was praised for her work. In interviews, she often said, "It wasn't just the crime that shocked people. It was the way Claire embraced it. She wanted to be remembered, and in that, she succeeded." Years passed, but Claire's story refused to fade. In classrooms, law students studied her trial. In psychology courses, professors spoke of her as an example of how some criminals lacked guilt. For the public, she became both a warning and a fascination. In prison, she received letters from strangers. Some wrote to condemn her, calling her evil. Others wrote with curiosity, wanting to know how she could smile in the face of life imprisonment. She rarely answered, but when she did, her letters were short and neat. One reply simply read, "Because fear is weakness, and I do not fear." Her reputation grew even inside the prison. Some inmates respected her calmness, others feared it. Once, when another prisoner tried to start a fight, Claire only smiled back. The woman froze, unsettled, and walked away. Guards later said Claire never needed to raise her fists. Her smile was enough. Richard's family never stopped grieving. His parents, who lived quietly in another town, avoided reporters, but once gave a statement. "She took him from us, and she never cared. That smile is not strength. It is cruelty." But no matter how much they tried to move on, Richard's death was always tied to her name, her face, and her chilling expression in court. Years into her sentence, a documentary crew was given permission to film inside Blackstone Prison. They interviewed Claire in a small room, cameras pointed at her. She wore the plain uniform, her hair tied back, but her eyes were bright, and her smile returned as soon as the questions began. The reporter asked, "Do you regret what happened to Richard?" Claire tilted her head, her smile never fading. "Regret is for people who want forgiveness," she said softly. "I never wanted it." The reporter pressed, "So you admit you killed him?" Claire leaned back and folded her hands. "What I admit doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you're still here, asking me questions. And you will keep asking, because you can't forget me." The interview shocked viewers across the country. Some said she was evil. Others said she was playing with the cameras. But everyone agreed her lack of remorse was terrifying. Detective Paul watched the program at home. He turned off the television halfway through, unable to watch her smile again. But even with the screen dark, her face stayed in his mind. Over time, Claire's health began to fade, but her smile never did. Guards said, even when she grew weaker, she carried the same expression as if she had won something no one else understood. She became a legend inside the prison, a figure who never cried, never begged, and never showed regret. When news of her death finally came, many thought the story was over. She was buried in a small graveyard near the prison. No flowers, no family, present. But the newspapers printed her picture one last time, the smiling widow eyes bright, lips curved upward. Even in death, she was remembered. For the people of Willow Creek, the trial remained a wound. For law students and criminologists, it became a lesson. And for those who had seen her in court, the memory of her smile would never leave. Claire Evans had killed her husband, poisoned him for money and freedom, and smiled as the world condemned her. She never showed remorse. She never broke. And, though her body now rested in the ground, her legacy lived on in every whisper, every book, every documentary that carried her story. In the end, she got what she wanted. She was never forgotten. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.